Okay, so we are going to start off today talking about categories and classifications of law. This is in the course handout book, depending on which version you have. It's either on page 2 or page 3. I noticed that this term they have the page numbers different than the previous term. So, at any rate, so I want to start off just with some background about what we're talking about, and sort of a rhetorical question. How many laws do you think we have in the United States? Any ideas? A lot, right? So why do I ask that question? Well, as you know, I'm a practicing attorney, and one of the things I have to do when I'm advising a client, or if I'm a prosecutor, I'm deciding what charges to implement, is I have to go through and determine what law applies to a particular circumstance so I know where to look. And so I have to be able to determine jurisdictional issues and what laws might apply. And so when I talk about how many laws are there, part of that process is we have to narrow down. I mean, there are literally millions of laws. I remember one year, it was New Year's Eve, I was watching TV, this is back, I don't know, probably 10 years ago, and I remember them saying that in that upcoming year there were going to be over 40,000 new laws that went into effect as of that January 1st. Just, that was like in 2008 or something. So, I mean, I don't know that there's an answer, how many millions of laws there are. When I say that, what I'm talking about is we have law made at the federal level, state level, city level, county, we have water districts, we have school districts, we have transportation districts, we have all sorts of little sub-units of the government that can make laws and rules. And so all of these are what basically is this body of law that we have here in the United States, and it grows every year. And so to be able to really start to get a handle on what laws might apply to a given circumstance, we have to categorize and put laws into various classifications to start with, so we know how to kind of narrow down what's going to apply. So that brings us to this page here. Let me get my glasses on. Okay, so categories and classifications of law. Now you'll see at the top here I have 80% list 4. Let me just tell you what that means. You're going to see my notes throughout this book that I'll have that. That is for fill in the blank questions. So on the midterm and also on the final, there will be fill in the blank questions. You'll type them in on the canvas. And I get those questions when I make up the test out of this book. And so they'll come off these pages that are kind of like list type pages. And so that's what I mean when I say percentage-wise 80%, so high probability. List 4 categories or classifications of law. That's basically the question that I would ask on the test, all right? Now you'll notice some of them say 100%, like this next page is going to be 100%. So let's just start here. So let's just say we have 1 million laws, okay? Ooh, there's my scratch page. All right, so let's just say we have 1 million laws, just to keep it sort of simple. All right, so we have to break down these million laws, and we're going to start with 2 very broad categories. So all of our laws are going to fall into one of these 2 very broad categories. The first is civil law, and the next is criminal law. So civil and criminal. So all the laws that we have are going to fall into one of those 2 categories. So that's the first thing I want you to understand is how do we tell the difference between a criminal law and a civil law? Now there are various different other nuances, but I'm going to break it down real simple, and that is if there is the possibility of jail time as one of the penalties for violating the law, then it's a criminal law. If there is the possibility that you could be incarcerated, put into jail, along with other potential penalties like a fine, probation, drug or alcohol counseling, etc. But if there is the possibility of jail time, even 1 day, it is considered a criminal law. Now obviously there are different levels of crimes. We're not going to get into criminal law a whole lot in this class other than just some examples. But when we talk about criminal law, we break it down further into what we call a felony or a misdemeanor. And there are also violations, but those are the two main subcategories or classifications. So a felony is a higher level or a worse crime, if you will. And that, the way that you determine a felony, at least in Oregon, and this will vary, is if the penalty is 1 year or more in jail, or actually it's more than 1 year, in jail, it's a felony. If it's 1 year or less, it would be considered a misdemeanor. So like a shoplifting case or something where the maximum penalty might be 30 days in jail, that would be a misdemeanor, okay? Now I'm not going to get into that too much in this course. I just want you to know this basic rule that if it's a criminal law, the way that you determine that is that there is the possibility of jail time, and if that's the case, it is a criminal law. Now it doesn't mean you're going to go to jail. So like if I went out and I have no record and I shoplifted, I stole a six-pack of Dr. Pepper or something, that's a theft 3, it's a low-level misdemeanor in Oregon. I'm not going to likely do any jail time. I'll be put on probation, have to do some community service, maybe go pick up some garbage on the side of the road or something, pay restitution, pay back the merchant for what I stole. But there is the possibility of jail time for violation of that law to 30 days. Even if I don't go to jail, it's still a criminal case. Now why does that matter? It matters because if it's a criminal case, then under the US Constitution and also under state constitutional law, then you have rights that kick in more so than if it's a civil case. You have a right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed. You have a right to remain silent under the 5th Amendment. You have various other rights, right to confront witnesses under the 6th Amendment. So you have rights that attach if it's a criminal case. Civil law is different, okay? So basically, civil law is the type of law that falls under anything that's not a crime. So if it's not a criminal law, no jail time, then it's considered a civil law. And the rules are different in civil court than they are criminal court. You have less rights if you're sued in civil court. So within civil law, and that's most of the type of law we're going to be talking about in this course, we have different other classifications where we break it down. So for example, at the top there, we have tort law. And we'll talk extensively about tort law in the next few weeks. But just for today, tort law is the area of law where if you harm somebody or you damage their property or their reputation, then you can be sued in civil court. Now, it's not a criminal case, it's a civil lawsuit. So this would fall under things like an automobile accident, medical malpractice for a doctor. It could be tort such as defamation, libel, or slander. If I publish something false about somebody, a battery, trespassing. There are a whole number of torts that we will talk about in a couple weeks, and that all falls under civil law. So if you back into my car in the parking lot and you damage my vehicle, I can sue you for the repair costs and the diminished value on my vehicle. That would be a civil lawsuit. So it's not going to be a criminal case. Now, with that said, criminal law and civil law do overlap. In other words, if I commit a crime, like if I run you over on purpose, that would be an assault, you could also sue me in civil court. So I could be charged in criminal court, and also you could sue me in civil court. So they're not exclusive, and we'll talk more about that issue later on in the term. But for today, I just want you to take away this real basic principle, and that is all of our laws are going to fall under one of two categories, very broad. Civil or criminal. And how do you tell the difference? Jail time. Right, exactly. If there's the possibility of jail time, it's considered a criminal case. Otherwise, it's going to be civil. So within civil law, we have tort law, we have contract law, which we'll talk about the second half of the term. Contract is a legally binding agreement, and we'll get into what constitutes contract law later on. So violation of the contract would be a civil lawsuit. Negligence and strict liability we'll talk about in a couple weeks. Negligence is an unintentional tort, it's accidental. So like an automobile accident, you can be sued for negligence even if you didn't mean To get into the accident, you were still negligent, so you're liable for any damages or injuries that you cause in a civil case. Question?
Civil for negligence, that would also fall under criminal law as well, right?
Maybe. Yeah, if I'm driving down the road and I'm fiddling with my radio and I don't notice that you're crossing the road, just because I'm, not paying attention, I'm violating a duty to you, that is to maintain a lookout. And if I run into you, that's a civil case, it's negligence. Now, if I do it on purpose, knowingly or intentionally, or if I may be under the influence of alcohol, it's reckless, then it's also going to be a criminal case. So there might be some overlap, but most automobile accidents are unintentional. Just you're spaced out, you're not really paying attention, and you run into a car or whatever. That's usually not going to be a criminal case. It might be, depending on the circumstance. But so there is overlap. Yeah. Family law, that would be dissolution of marriage or divorce, adoptions, custody cases, child support, spousal support, etc. Falls under civil. Probate, which we'll talk about at the end of the term, but just for today, probate is after someone dies, you go to court, and the judge will oversee the administration of somebody's estate. If they have a will, make sure the will's being followed. If they don't have a will, the law will divide up assets, and that's all done in the probate court. Real estate law, purchase and sale agreements, easements, and that kind of thing, we'll talk a little bit about later on in the term. That all falls under civil law as well. Civil enforcement and traffic violations. Well, let's start with civil enforcement. Down here. Okay, so when I talk about civil enforcement, this is a growing area of law. And it really has been for about the last 25, 30, more than that even years. And when I say civil enforcement, what I mean is enforcement of a civil rule, usually by an administrative agency. So for example, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, their job is to implement rules for employers, safety on the job. So if I'm a construction company, for example, and I'm having you do roofing as my employee, I have to have safety equipment that you wear, like a harness and that kind of thing if you're up on a roof. And if I violate those rules, I'm subject to a civil monetary penalty. And it may be a lot of money, maybe hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars for a safety violation. So that's a form of a civil case, because it's not going to be jail time, but it potentially has a lot of money involved, and it's enforced through an administrative agency. That's also true for environmental regulations, licensing, like I'm an attorney. If I do something wrong, I can have my license taken away from me, be disbarred. That's all done through what's called civil enforcement. Traffic violations fall under civil law, like a speeding ticket. Most of the time, you didn't stop at a stop sign, or you didn't signal before a lane change. That is a civil traffic violation. It's enforced by the police, so it kind of looks like a criminal case, but if it's just a traffic ticket, it's civil, so it's a monetary fine. Now you could get both, like driving under the influence and failure to obey a stop sign. And one would be criminal, one would be civil. But just for today, most traffic violations are going to be a form of a civil type of a violation, monetary fine only, in other words. And then this final category I have down here is other non-criminal law. So basically, any other type of law that's not criminal is automatically falls under the civil law categorization. Okay, so real simple. If there's jail time as a potential, it's criminal. Otherwise, it's civil. Real simple. That's going to be the nice, clean, simple test for this class. And again, the reason why it matters, if it's a criminal case, you have more rights under the Constitution if you're accused of a crime than if you're sued in civil court. All right. The next two types of law, a little bit more complicated. Now remember, we're breaking down our law. We have a million laws. We're going to start off with criminal and civil. Now we're going to break it down even further into two other real broad categories. And that's going to be substantive law and procedural law. Substantive law and procedural law. Okay? I'm going to start with procedural law first because it's a little bit easier to understand. So procedural law is a law that will set forth what steps have to be followed in order for some action to be legal. So for example, procedure in a criminal case. If I'm a police officer, I have rules I have to follow. If I pull somebody over, I have to have a reason, either reasonable suspicion that they committed a traffic violation or probable cause for a crime. I have to read somebody their rights. If I'm arresting them, I have to book them. They have to go to court within 48 hours to be read what charges are going to be filed. Those are all forms of criminal procedure. What steps you've got to follow in order to legally convict somebody of a crime. Same thing in court. I'm a former prosecutor. We have rules that we have to follow in criminal court, evidence code, the type of questions we ask witnesses, how it's called chain of custody, from when the police officer seizes evidence, maybe in the trunk of a vehicle, until I get it into court. We have to follow all the steps and who had control over it to make sure it wasn't altered. All of those kind of things are procedures that must be followed. If a procedure is not followed correctly in criminal law, then a judge may throw out the case because criminal procedures were not properly followed, and that's a constitutional violation. All right, so procedure, what steps you got to follow. We also have civil procedural law. So here's my little chart here. So we have criminal procedure, and we also have civil procedure. So an example of that would be landlord-tenant law. Let's say I want to rent you a house. I'm a landlord. You're my tenant. I have rules I have to follow on what type of contracts I have to provide you, and if you don't pay rent, whether or not I can evict you, and all of those kind of things. I have to give you proper notice, and if I don't, then the eviction's invalid. Or if it's a home loan and you're not paying your loan, a bank wants to foreclose, they've got procedures they have to follow. And if they don't follow them correctly, your foreclosure is invalid. Okay? So procedural law, what steps do you have to follow? Now, usually the easiest way to kind of remember procedural law is there's usually going to be a court and court rules involved. Okay? Rules on how you go to court or arbitration or some other type of a hearing. What steps do you have to follow? Those are procedural rules. Now, the other type of law is called substantive law. Right. This is a little bit harder to explain. Substantive law is basically law that's not procedural. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay? So substantive law would be something like a law that tells you how old you have to be in order to do something legally, maybe buy a beer or to enter into a contract to buy a house, a home loan, or some other law that tells you an age to get a driver's license maybe. That's a substantive law. You have to be 16 years old to get a driver's license. You have to be 21 years old to buy a beer. That's a law that tells you a definition, an amount. A speed limit is another type of a substantive law. If the speed limit's 55 miles per hour, that tells me what the rule is. If I violate that, then the procedures on how I'm to be convicted would kick in. So I violate the substantive law because I'm going 80 miles an hour on I-5, and then the police officer has steps they've got to go through to give me a ticket, and I can then go to court. That would be the procedural side. The substantive side is the speed limit. The procedural side is what steps have to be followed to convict me. So substantive law is an age, a number like a speed limit. It could be a definition of what is a type of crime, which I'll show you later on in the term. or a definition of what is a tort, various torts that we have, assault and battery and trespass, etc. And we'll look at those in detail in a few weeks. Those are all substantive. It's a definition, a number, an age, an interest rate, a monthly payment, the terms of a contract. Those are all types of substantive law. Now, if you don't get it exactly today, don't worry about it. I will be giving you examples of procedural and substantive as we work our way through the term. But just that way when I use those terms, you know what I'm talking about. You'll have an idea. All right, so we now can break everything down into either criminal or civil, procedural or substantive. So we have civil procedure, civil substantive, criminal procedure, criminal substantive. So we're breaking it down as we go. All right. Next we have public law and private law. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these two because they don't have as much distinction in the United States, at least, more so in European countries where they have different courts for public law and private law. So basically the idea of public law is a law, probably the easiest way to think of it is a law that applies to the public as a whole. So like criminal law. Criminal law applies to everybody. Public law is law that's typically made by a governmental entity rather than a private entity. So criminal law would be traffic rules and procedures, tax code. Public law also refers to the law that defines how government is established, like a constitution or other type of laws that set up various agencies. So public law is a law that's applicable to the public at large, typically created by a governmental entity, and also how a government is structured. Private law is law that governs the interactions among individuals or private companies. And the best example I can think of is contract law. So for example, if I hire you to be my employee to manage my restaurant, we enter into an employment contract. And I'm going to pay you a salary, give you benefits and that kind of thing. And in exchange, you're going to do various different tasks to manage my books and my menu and my website and be a manager and do staffing and all that. You're going to agree to work with me for a period of time, and you're also going to agree not to disclose my secret recipes, right? So you're going to do a non-disclosure agreement, so you don't give away my hot wing recipe or whatever. It's good too. But, yeah, sweet and sour with buffalo sauce. You're right. So as part of that, let's say I hire you, you go out and publish on the internet my super good hot wing sauce. I can then sue you for violating the contract because that's essentially a form of law between the two of us. Now that doesn't apply to everybody else. If somebody figures out how I came up with my super good wing sauce on their own, that's nothing I can do about it. But if you do that, you violate the contract, I can then sue you for breach of contract. So it's a form of a private law between us. So contract law is probably the best example. Now again, I'm not going to really harp on that in this class. These two categories don't really have much relevance. Again, they do in other countries where they have different legal systems than we do. So don't really worry about it too much in this class. It's the first four that I'm mostly interested that you know. And again, civil law versus criminal law. The way you tell the difference is jail time. And then we have substantive law and procedural law. Okay? All right, so 80% possible fill in the blank question on the midterm exam. List 4 categories or classifications of law. And that, real simple. Anything off this page is a fine answer. So that brings us to the next page. This is on page 3 or 4, depending on which version of the book you have. Sources of law. You see there, it's 100%. It's a very important page. this absolutely for sure will be a fill-in-the-blank question on the midterm. What are 6 sources of law? That's just one of the things off of this page I want you to know. This is actually a very important page. There's a lot going on here, even though it looks really simple. So let me explain what I'm talking about. So first of all, real basic. This page is a list of the various names of the major types of laws that we have at the federal and state level throughout the United States. United States Code, for example, administrative rules, Code of Federal Regulations. And we'll go through them. So this is, at the real basic level, a list of the laws that the types of laws that we have, okay? But it's more than that. This is also a list in more or less order of the authority level of each source of law. Now, I like to make a little comparison. Poker and law, right? The game of poker, right? Texas Hold'em or 5 cards straight or draw or whatever. When you're playing poker, you have different, it's called an hierarchy, different levels of hands. So what's the best hand you can have in poker, assuming no wild card? Anyone? Royal flush? Yeah. So ace, king, queen, jack, 10, all of the same suit, hearts or diamonds or whatever. So if I have a royal flush, I will probably win that hand, unless somebody else has a royal flush, and then we push and go on to the next hand, okay? So then from there, we work our way down. Straight flush, 4 of a kind, on down until you get to basically nothing. What's the worst hand you can have in poker? You're going to have 5 cards, so 6 high, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, that'd be a straight, 7 high. 7, 5, 4, 3, 2. Okay? I should know, that would be the one I would get, right? I'm horrible at poker. If you ever want to win money, give me a call, and I'll be your, you'll get all my money. I'm horrible at poker. All right, so what do I mean? So just like in poker, we have different levels of laws. And a higher law, just like in poker, will beat a lower law. And this is what we do as lawyers when we're going to court, we're writing up legal paperwork, we're doing legal research. We are trying to find the highest level law that we can find that will support our case. The highest, of course, being the United States Constitution, which is our royal flush of law. If the U.S. Constitution provides us with an answer, if it's a guaranteed fundamental right under the Bill of Rights or other constitutional provision, that will override or beat every other lower level law that we have. The U.S. Constitution is the royal flush of law. So